These are going to be some of the best tricks that you will ever need to complete some of the hardest Roblox obbies to have ever been beaten. And whether or not this will only help you in the long term throughout your obbying experiences, it's easy to get better than most other players at Roblox obbies once you understand Roblox's physics and some of these well-known tricks by the best Roblox hobbyists out there. As long as you find the obbies enjoyable, that is. So with that said, there will be 8 chapters to this video based on the 8 difficulties you can see here, which will each feature what I believe to be the most important tips and tricks to take away from each difficulty so you can progress further, going in order from the intense difficulty all the way up to the unreal difficulty, as that is the physical human limit of Roblox obbies. But I would heavily suggest not skipping through any chapter, as you've probably missed a lot of these tricks even if you manage to overcome the first difficulties. And one very important piece of information to know first of all about Roblox obbies: the reason I'm going to be starting from the intense difficulty rather than the absolute beginning is because for any obbies below the intense difficulty, if you happen to be a beginner, it's usually just going to be a natural process of learning how to do the basic mechanics, as this mostly depends on what games you're going to play. So I would mostly recommend playing a game such as Jukes Towers of Hell or difficulty chart obbies at first, and try to focus on understanding how muscle memory and camera control works, along with when you should and shouldn't use shift lock, as these are the main key features that every difficult obby will rely on. So most of the time you're going to quickly be developing muscle memory for using shift lock and being able to land jumps such as 9-stud wraparounds or 3-stud stickouts. It's actually pretty simple once you understand how momentum works and how to correctly time a jump late enough, for example. Just don't go into obbies thinking you're going to be able to beat hard obbies right away. And I would also suggest looking at the order that somebody like Adamir, or me in this case, would press their keys while landing a jump that you aren't able to land. So that's why I'm going to be using no board for the entirety of this video. But with that said, for all the beginners out there, it's time to start from the early stages of the intense difficulty. One of the most important things for the intense difficulty is to never, and I mean never in your life, approach obbies for the sole purpose of wanting to become better than others. This will actually demotivate you most of the time, which I do know it might be hard to not be demotivated for some people out there when everybody around you is improving much faster and doing all of these extremely difficult obbies. But trust me, it's better if you just enjoy the process rather than demotivate yourself by comparing yourself to the best players out there. Speaking of which, some of the best players out there can actually be quite toxic to others. So please, just don't listen to this kind of stuff if somebody is calling you shit at the game or something. It's literally a video game after all, and you're meant to at least somewhat enjoy it. But hey, I'm sure you can't enjoy obbies if you aren't even able to practice them. And this is a huge reason to why I would personally always recommend games such as Jukes Towers of Hell, or even tiered obbies in this situation, which are obbies that get twice as much harder by each tier, because you're actually able to properly practice these obbies in their own practice places, without having to only be relying on trial and error for games such as Flood Escape 2, which is why I dislike that game. And believe me when I say this, literally most obbies above the Remorseless difficulty will require some form of practice, even for the best hobbyists out there sometimes. So as much as you might dislike practicing because it's tedious, it will literally be the one and only thing preventing you from never completing one of the hardest obbies on Roblox someday. So with that said, why don't we talk about the first actual trick that most Roblox players have never heard of. Now, this might be a little complex for the intense difficulty, but this will help you in so many different situations in the future, cause I'm sure all of us have accidentally climbed on a 2-star part like this, and then you just ended up failing all the way down because you couldn't get back on top of it. But you can actually get back up 100% of the time with this simple trick by turning your camera sideways and holding D, but as soon as you start holding D, you also want to shift lock just like I did. And over time this will get more consistent once you manage to pull it off for the first time. However, you wouldn't be able to really get anywhere with some of the hardest obbies on Roblox if you don't understand how to use momentum to your advantage when it comes to long jumps, such as 12-star jumps. And really, it comes down to 3 main ways to consistently pull off 12 start jumps, for example, with the first one requiring you to use shift rock and simply timing your jump as late as possible after you start holding A or D, while being as perfectly sideways as possible. But the second way is what I would always recommend doing for most jumps, which is to get in this exact slanted position at the end of one part and stop using shift rock, then hold D and press space as you can see on screen, but shift rock sideways again mid-air before landing the jump, which allows you to get an extra forward momentum boost after jumping, so that you can land the wrong jump easily. And the third way is basically the same as the second, but rather you never shift rock mid-air and you simply turn your camera forward like this before jumping and climb the end of the part after jumping as late as possible. However, doing these tricks can be quite stressful sometimes, which is why at this point it would be a good idea to develop some good nerve control, since a lot of towers at this point will have many unsafe sections, which are usually outside sections that make you restart everything from the very beginning if you make one mistake. And I would recommend thoroughly learning and practicing these unsafe sections the most out of any other part in most of these towers, since obviously you don't want to lose all of your progress with one single mistake. However, a huge roadblock that I often spot among many players at this point is people struggling with even understanding how to frick consistently and glide across trusses or ladders, or even struggling to jump off of a truss or ladder, let alone being consistent at fricking.
That took half an hour, but I'm back. I just can't mess up this time. Come on. I don't know how to do this.
As this is where Obbies start to require some decent camera control skills, and it's once again extremely simple once you manage to pull it off a few times. Because for jumping off of trusses and ladders, you first want to make sure you're not too close to the truss, as you will just walk off when trying to go downwards if you are, but you can easily prevent that by holding space and W at the top, and then going downwards after you stop holding both at the same time. But when it comes to gliding across a ladder or truss, turn on shift rock while facing forward and tilt your camera slightly into whichever direction you're going, and then simply hold D or A, or if you want to be careful you can also just keep your camera straight forward and hold W while also holding D or A, which is much slower but very useful, especially if you want to stop at the very end of a truss or ladder. And when it comes to freaking off of a ladder or truss, you can do this by using shift rock, which is a lot easier, or you can do it the professional way by relying on camera control for the frick, but I would suggest relying on the shift rock method most of the time, as this will get extremely consistent and will be part of your muscle memory over time once you start to consistently pull it off, which unsurprisingly it's also the same for fricking using camera control rather than the shift rock method, although this method can sometimes screw you over unless you're very consistent at it over time. So with that said, it's time to move on to the Remorseless difficulty, since you should by now have learned a lot more than your average Roblox player tends to know. What most don't really know is that Roblox Obbies actually somewhat depend on what FPS you use, because higher FPS above 120 overall make most jumps a lot easier. But have you ever tried to bounce off of a truss but instead you just get flung off of it like this? Well, that's because you're using a high frame rate, and even though there are ways to avoid this, such as flicking your mouse so that you're further away from the truss, as that prevents you from being flung off of it whenever you jump, it's not very convenient for beginners until you're at the Remorseless difficulty and above, since if you've been using the highest frame rate possible, I would heavily suggest not doing that whenever you're playing any kind of Roblox Obby. Instead, I would mostly suggest to use anything between 60 to 120 FPS for beginners, and 120 to 144 FPS once you are able to consistently flick like outwards on trusses to prevent being flung off whenever you jump off of them. Or you can just simply switch between frame rates to prevent being flung off whenever you're doing a truss like this. But another important thing to keep in mind at this point is that you should always play the towers or the obbies that you actually at least somewhat enjoy, rather than forcing yourself to beat the most atrocious and low effort obbies out there. Other than that though, by this point you should definitely get consistent at long jumps and 10-stud wraparounds, along with maybe even landing your first 4-stud stick out, as this is honestly all about running the right timing and momentum with a good amount of camera control. It's actually not a bad idea to try and land some difficult jumps at this point. But what about the trusses in the thumbnail? How would one do that? Well, this is also something you may see in some towers or obbies at this point of difficulty, and you first want to look out and make sure if the top part of the truss extends out by one or more studs, since if it's only one stud, you might start to get pushed out sometimes and fall off of the truss. So just be careful and keep holding W while controlling your camera so you don't fall until Roblox physics decide to stop being silly and let you stay on the truss, which you then want to follow by just holding W or D and space so that you can glide across the top carefully while keeping control of your mouse. And once you're at the other side, you can simply stop and go downwards to jump off. Or if you're an impatient professional, you can start learning how to correctly time pressing your D key while gliding your camera across the truss like this, which will require some really good muscle memory of timings and camera control, but this will get consistent over time. I myself actually personally learned how to do this when I had already beaten a Catastrophic difficulty tower, which is quite funny since it's definitely not that hard. But with that said, something a majority of Roblox obbies will always tend to use are all kinds of Roblox glitches, such as dance clipping, laugh clipping, lodges, and much more, which is exactly why I've made an entire 20-minute video explaining every single glitch I could possibly find, which will help you tremendously in the long term as well. So I heavily suggest watching the entirety of this video if you want to learn how to do every glitch on Roblox, or well, almost all of them. But with that said, have you ever come across a wraparound with a roof above it? Well, this is called a walk around, and you might absolutely suck ass at this the first time you're met with it, but don't worry, as it gets extremely consistent if you do it the right way, by holding W against the wall while holding D and turning your camera around at the same time, as you can see. Cause for some reason most of the time I don't see people realizing that you can just hold W against the wall to make it 1,000 times easier, unless it's a 3-stud walk around, but you shouldn't really see those that often. And by this point you should also know how to use alignment keys, unless you're sadly a mobile player, because this is a PC only thing. But basically you can press the comma and period keys to align your camera perfectly in a backward or forward direction, which will be very useful for wall hops as well in case you ever come across those in an obby, as all you have to do is hold A or D and press W against the wall before wall hopping, and then use your alignment keys and press space to wall hop, followed by once again quickly pressing W so you're back up fully against the wall, and keep repeating this while wall hopping to consistently wall hop, unless you happen to be wall hopping around the cylinder or like a slanted part, because that will require you to do this purely from camera control skills rather than alignment keys. And that's about everything you will need in order to confidently move on to the insane difficulty, which is the biggest roadblock for most hobbyists out there, as beating your first soul crushing difficulty tower can be quite challenging. And in case you're wondering, soul crushing stands for the next 4 difficulties in order. At this point, everything will become quite advanced, and this next tip might piss some of you off, but that's okay, because for the love of God, I heavily suggest not using skips. And by this, I mean don't use glitches like lag high jumps to skip entire sections of an obby, such as how you can skip the entirety of floor 3 in the Tower of Finning layers by using lag high jumps. And the reason for this isn't because it's cheating or something, that's not what I'm trying to say, but rather it's because because you're going to be developing a mindset where you will always want to use skips whenever it's possible to do so. And if a tower has no skips to make it easier, you will probably hate it. Besides that though, you should also get consistent at extended stickouts by now. And the best way to do an extended stickout, like you can see here, is to slightly tilt your angle against the wall before jumping, as this gives you more momentum. Or if you really want to make sure you're going to land it, you can also do whatever this /E dance 2 strategy is, and then shift rock sideways and jump right, so that you have a lot more momentum. But this might actually do the complete opposite and kill your entire momentum if you do it wrong, and it can make you fail unless you get consistent at it. Something else you might see quite often in some obbies though are extended walkarounds and 11-star high jumps, which actually work the same way as you would normally do a walkaround by holding W against the wall, but make sure you don't go too far to the side, as that can kill your momentum. And for high jumps, there's actually no possible way to get it consistently, but you will get it most of the time if you stick to the wall and do exactly what I'm doing here, as you can see. Just pay attention to the order I place my keys in though. And with that out of the way, the next trick is an extremely useful one that you will absolutely need, cause for any kind of truss-flick head hitter jumps like this one, please don't do it this way without shift rock or by flicking manually. Instead, you can just simply slant yourself to the left or right, as much as I do, and then press S and space, shift rock mid-air, and hold W forwards to land the head hitter. This will make any truss-flick head hitter 1,000 times easier once you have learned this timing consistently. And since we're on the topic about trusses again, that will have to bring us to downwards and upwards momentum. And oh boy, I cannot explain just how useful this is for so many of the hardest obbies ever beaten on Roblox. But let's start off with upwards truss momentum for truss head hitters. If you have a truss head hitter like this, you want to switch to 60 FPS in every circumstance, and then time it correctly and hold W and space whilst jumping constantly until you land on top of the pot. In case you time it wrong though, just redo it and don't get scared. But from this we can also learn that holding W and then jumping gives you an upwards momentum, and you can actually use this upwards momentum for so many advantages in different ways. But you first need to get used to the fact that you have to look at the opposite direction from your front on a truss, which will switch the S and W keys to do the opposite movement because you're looking backwards obviously. With that said though, holding W for a little bit and then pressing space to jump off and shift rocking mid-air will give you a huge momentum boost for any kind of truss momentum jumps like this one, especially if there is a roof above your head, preventing you from jumping off normally. And this works the same for upwards momentum as well if you hold S, which lets you easily do jumps like this one with 100% precision. From now on though, I think you've hopefully understood that the best way to do a specific trick is by looking at the keyboard in the corner rather than listening to me yapping. So since we're about to get to the extreme difficulty, here's a huge tip. From this point onwards, you really have to kind of just cope with the amount of fails you will have, because most obbies past this point can never be done in just a few attempts, even by the best hobbyists out there. So always keep in mind that it's not worth raging and breaking your keyboard over any kind of fail. And please never take the game too seriously, because once again it's just a video game, you're meant to have fun with it. But with that out of the way, here comes the extreme chapter. By this point, most of these obbies are starting to get very complex, as they sometimes begin to introduce what's known as jank, which is basically a style of gameplay that you're currently looking at. So realistically speaking, you will never learn every single trick that exists out there until you practice enough and find your own consistent ways to land every single jump. But if there's ever a few jumps that simply don't get consistent no matter what, there has to be either like a secret strategy that you just have to find, or I would simply suggest looking on a previous YouTube completion of the obby that you're playing, and then see how that player did it. And with that said, another very useful and advanced trick for trusses and ladders though, would be to slightly slant your camera sideways like I do here, and then hold D and press space like you would for a flick, which can help you quite a lot in a few scenarios if you for example have a wall behind you, as this will give you a hard momentum boost whenever you flick sideways using this strategy. And if there's a slanted part like this one with a stick out on the final stretch of the tart of bloodthirsty Kinos, you always want to jump against the wall and hold W against the wall and then do the stick out, as you will be higher up on the slanted part by doing this. Otherwise you would probably lose all of your momentum and just fail the jump. With that trick out of the way though, let's say you have to jump from a high height into a small gap inside of a wall, which for this you will have to time your jump correctly in the air, and then flick your camera inside the gap, preferably with first person like I did, since this prevents you from just continuing to fall down. And you also want to make sure that you're always facing like sideways inside of any kind of gap like this, which if you're not and you're just holding W, you're probably going to fail. So with that said, I'm sure this next one will help quite a few people out there, because have you ever seen a slanted flick like this before? Since a lot of people tend to get stuck when faced with this jump. And so what I always tend to do is try and land as much inside of the truss as possible, and then press W a few times so that I'm as far upwards as I can be, but without getting all the way up, and then face sideways as much as you possibly can for the specific jump you're doing, and then flick sideways with shift lock without ever moving to the left or right, whilst pulling this off, as that will make your entire position invalid in some situations. And the reason I say that is because you can usually fix it by using camera control like this, so that's how you can make slanted trusses consistent. And surprisingly, that's basically all there is for the extreme difficulty, since most of the time it's going to overall just rely on the same tricks that you've already learned along the way, with the exception that the gameplay will just be more difficult and precise for the extreme difficulty. So shiver me timbers, here comes the terrifying difficulty chapter. From now on, you're not only probably going to have to watch a video on any obby you're doing, since they will probably have some good methods of landing every single jump, but you're also going to have to practice a lot more than ever before. And you also want to start doing separate runs in whatever obby you're playing, like doing a tower in like 5 total runs before attempting it legitimately, because trust me, as tedious as that might be to do for you, it's worth it to build up consistency before you legitimately attempt the tower. And you should also have learned many different ways to use the previous tricks you've learned to your advantage for all kinds of jumps, such as climbing apart and then slanting sideways just like you did for the 13-start long jump method, to gain a higher height boost and momentum boost whenever you do any form of stick out or lap around like these two, or such as using the long jump momentum trick for head hitters instead, since this makes every head hitter like a lot easier, or even such as climbing the corner of a slanted lap around like I do here, as this will be a technique that you will need in a lot of the hardest obbies ever beaten, even if it might not just be for a simple lap around like this one, along with always landing slanted sideways like this inside of any gap such as a 1-star gap, as you will often see those among the hardest obbies on Roblox, especially from this difficulty forwards. So with all of that said, this next trick will help you so much for any kind of truss or ladder flicks, because you can actually high jump for every flick you do at the same time if you go slightly downwards until the bottom of your torso almost aligns with the end of the stud texture, and even if you don't notice it, this does actually make you jump slightly higher than you normally would on a flick. Oh, and yeah, this is another trick that isn't actually that useful most of the time, but you can also just press W and then space as soon as your character goes into a straight position in order to flick upwards without using your mouse or shift lock, so that's pretty cool. But you know what's even cooler? The fact that you can always avoid losing all of your momentum whenever you jump off of a wedge or slanted part like this, by climbing the end of it and then shift locking sideways back onto the part you are just on, as that somehow just prevents you from losing your momentum whenever you jump off. But besides that though, another very useful fact about wedges and slanted parts is that if you go off sideways, you will bounce upwards whenever you go off of it, which is pretty useful to know for a section like this where you would have to hold W against the wall and bounce off of a wedge. But similarly to not using your momentum on wedges and slanted parts though, you can also avoid losing all of your momentum on bars and cylinders, or well, spheres as Roblox wants you to call them. Because if you do a bar or cylinder jump with shift lock sideways like this, you would always lose all of your momentum. But it's actually pretty easy to avoid that by simply going out of shift lock and then jumping off with your character facing forwards before shift locking mid-air to land the jump you're doing, which also works for slanted parts sometimes. So with that said, there's actually one more trick left to the terrifying difficulty, and that is ladder and truss bouncing, which is similar to the method used for high jumping on ladders and trusses, as all you have to do is slightly go downwards a little bit, and then just treat it like a flick without ever pressing space, which is extremely useful for sections like this one with a part above your head, and you will definitely require doing this for a lot of sections among the hardest obbies on Roblox, quite often. So you're basically ready for the catastrophic difficulty at this point. But make sure you always remember that you really do have to focus on building up your consistency as well in all of these obbies, rather than just simply winging every single jump until you just get it done in practice. Which is why what I'm about to say might surprise some of y'all, but I would actually never recommend out jumping obbies believing that it would improve your skill. Because the reason it doesn't actually improve your skill is because most of the time you're going to be out jumping an obby, you're just most likely going to try and do every single jump until you just get it done, rather than focusing on actually developing a strategy for it. But anyways, just a quick reminder to subscribe and like the video if you've been enjoying it so far, as I would truly appreciate it since it helps me out a lot more than you could ever imagine. But anyways, it's time to move on to the catastrophic difficulty chapter now. At this point, there would be so many quote-unquote tricks that it's better to call them strategies, as it's overall just reusing every single trick you've learned up until this point, in different but very specific ways, with a perfect example to start off here being the Tower of Generation failure, as this requires most of the tricks you've learned until this point used in various different ways, and it's a very good idea to always find the correct strategies for every single jump in towers or obbies of this difficulty. But if you're dealing with a jump that just has no consistent strategy whatsoever like this one here, you kinda have to cope with it just like the jump on screen right now. I personally cannot find a way to do this consistently no matter what I've tried. However, there is a trick to make slanted trusses like these two right here extremely consistent, which surprisingly this trick also helps you tremendously for truss flicks with only one start to flick off from, like this one right here in the Tower of Blind Fate. Although with that said, the next stud bouncing trick is one of the most complex but possible tricks out there, as it requires you to perfectly time your camera control and shift lock like this in order to slightly bounce upwards from literally any part like I did here. And due to how difficult and ultimately inconsistent it is to pull this trick off, you will rarely ever see this trick being used among the hardest obbies on Roblox, but you just never know when you will need this. With all of that said though, I'll now be mentioning some of the most well-known catastrophic difficulty towers on Roblox, and which one you should actually do depending on what specific skill set you want to improve in at this point of difficulty. At this point, you should most likely realize that there are actually no specific tricks left to run anymore, as it will always be custom strategies that you, as the player, have to either get consistent at, or simply figure out on your own if nobody else has before. And here's a quick example of what I mean by custom strategies that happen to be consistent using a combination of previously run tricks. For this jump on floor 2 of the Tower of Spiritual Rise, which is found in the Eternal Abyss, you have to align your cursor to the middle of this highlighted part of the stud, and then go downwards until your torso is right in between the middle of the ladder parts, followed by facing the truss and holding W and pressing space quite late, which just somehow always works as long as you don't fail the timing. So this is the kind of stuff you will always have to deal with at this point of difficulty. But don't worry, because there are quite a lot of tips for the horrific and unreal difficulties rather than tricks. Such as the fact that you will 100% sometimes start to repeatedly fail the first sections of the tower over and over again, but since you've already become this addicted to Roblox Obbies, this is quite normal and your consistency will spike back up either after taking a break and calming down for a while, or by simply continuing with trial and error until your consistency is back. However, it's more recommended to take a break until your mind is fresh again, because yes, surprise surprise, being angry will almost always result in having consistency. And another good tip is that you should always try and lock in as much as you can, even on the first few floors of any horrific tower you're playing once you're done practicing them, because focusing on successfully passing those floors more often than failing them is a huge step into the right direction with your consistency for that specific tower, and it will also keep you much more motivated throughout your entire grind. But one of the biggest tips for staying motivated has to be finding the right horrific difficulty tower with the right skill set required for you to complete that tower, because believe me or not, in some situations it's better to do a mid horrific or even high horrific difficulty tower rather than doing a baseline horrific difficulty tower if you don't happen to enjoy it at all. It's also a good idea at this point to start looking at each one of your fails as simply being part of the road to complete whatever tower you're attempting, rather than looking at your fails as a huge loss or something, no matter how long it's been. And you should also practice the out of any tower you're playing, even if it means you're going to have to practice for over 50 hours. Since that's basically what you yourself have signed up for whenever it comes to being one of the best hobbyists on Roblox. But with that said, what even is there to talk about for the Unreal difficulty? Well, once again, it's the exact same scenario as it has been for the horrific difficulty, except there's even less tips for this difficulty, and every strategy will just simply be even more complex than it's ever been until this point. So that's why it all comes down to one single question. Do you have the true dedication to spend anywhere between 100 to 1000 or more hours in order to complete anything of this difficulty? Because I would say you shouldn't ever do this unless you have a goal in mind with true dedication towards it, and that goal being to literally be among the top 50 best players on Roblox in terms of how far Obbies can go. So with all of that said, what better way to end this off rather than with some Unreal difficulty towers, along with what skill set each one of these towers will require the most of in order to complete. I bet you suddenly didn't expect me to talk here, did you now? Anyways, I really hope this video will help out a lot of people with the way Roblox physics work. And if you like my content, then subscribe and like so YouTube recommends more of it. And also because I really want to someday have 100,000 subscribers. So anyways, thank you for watching, hope you're having a good day, bye bye.